Einstein once said, "Imagination is more important than knowledge."
Mr. Carbonaro, James's ninth-grade history teacher, was finishing up a container of fruit salad, picking through cantaloupe and a bruised grape with a fork as he leaned against his desk. He had planted his buttocks right next to a cup of ballpoint pens and a miniature gallows model as he eyed James, who slouched awkwardly in front of him.
So I'll give you credit for imagination, James.
If Carbonaro hadn't pinned him down with his eyes, James would have managed to slip, unnoticed, out of the classroom with the rest of his classmates when the bell rang. He could have easily hidden behind Arna, the Indo-American girl who'd been drawing her favorite band onto her forearm with Egyptian blue ink during the lecture. But Mr. Carbonaro hadn't given him a chance. He had eyes that could zoom in like a telephoto lens on a phone camera. James had been trying to refrain from making an eye roll all period, but he couldn't resist now.
If you do that anymore today, your eyes will fall out of your head and roll around on my clean floor, young man,
Carbonaro said. He had a striking resemblance to Bryan Cranston, but he was too much of a dweeb to do anything cool like cook meth, so it didn't make history any more interesting.
Good sleep in my class?
When the bell had rung, James had had to peel the side of his face from his history book, and there was a reddened imprint of the cover running up his jaw and cheek.
Oops.
So yes, in fact, he did,
Yes, sir.
James admitted cheekily. Mr. Carbonaro frowned, noting his tone.
Now let's discuss.
He picked up the essay in question and began to read.
Myths and fairy tales have been misrepresented in our culture since time immemorial.
He raised his eyes at James.
Time immemorial, James.
He read on without waiting for a response.
Scholars believe they are fictions passed down for generations. But in truth, they simply come from a place you can reach through a wormhole.
Mr. Carbonaro snorted through his nose and some of the juice came out, which he wiped away quickly. Then, suppressing his laughter, he leaned back on his desk.
How's Call of Duty?
Don't play it.
Was all James could mumble at the moment, and gave his loose hoodie a tug.
Then what are you smoking? Because I'd like to try it.
Wow, that was a real plot twist, James thought. Mr. Heisenberg admits he wants to smoke a doobie after class with me.
Oh, would you, sir?
Carbonaro smoothed his eyebrows, rolled his eyes at the tepid response, then walked around the desk and found an eraser to begin on the whiteboard.
Mrs. Mundwiller says you're distracted too.
You talked to Mrs. Monwiller about me?
James didn't see what his biology teacher had to do with fairy tales, or history, for that matter. He also wondered what led them to talk about him.
I wanted to know if you wrote as much trash in her class, or if you just hated history. Maybe you should take creative writing. The rest is comic book material.
He said, handing the paper full of marks to James.
And it didn't exposit on the moral lessons anthologists have given to fairy tales, as the assignment called for. I'd have given you a grade higher than an F if you'd at least wrote something I could sell to Disney Studios. But your ideas weren't original.
Guess it sucked, huh?
Mr. Carbonaro liked impersonating his students in ways he hoped would make them laugh, as he did now. He stuck his head forward and said in a sort of nasal baritone,
Gee, guess it sucked, man.
I'll take the F.
Yeah, I'll take the F, man.
Carbonaro imitated, returning to his desk and leaning back to push the gallows model over.
Well, can't say that you haven't come a long way, James. Personally, I don't know you, but...
James hunched forward and sighed.
Let me guess. You've heard stuff.
Heard?
Mr. Carbonaro knit his eyebrows. James looked at him and gave a soft snort.
Course you have.
Well, I'm not going to lie.
But you will, James thought.
Yes, I've heard about your past.
It's about time we got around to the elephant, James thought. Mr. Carbonaro glanced at his potted plant, which looked like it could have used a little watering, and collected his thoughts. His forehead wrinkled as he tried to smear the juices on his fingers into oblivion by rubbing them together.
It was no secret that he was a troubled man.
You mean crazy.
There it was. By now, he was used to teachers taking him aside and asking him, "How are you hanging in there, kiddo?" Most of them just wanted a glimpse into his mind, to see what kind of child grew up in the household of Mr. Dreadful. Yes, Mr. Dreadful. the great and notorious magician who took the world by storm with his phenomenal magic acts, only to fall into madness. James was 5 when that all happened. He didn't remember a whole lot. Well, he was attending Murray High now, so that was quite a while ago. But everyone wanted to hear stories about his grandpa. Some of them just wanted to see the tattoo of the 2 entwined snakes on the back of James's neck. He didn't know the history of the tattoo. It had something to do with his past. That was as much as he could speculate. He was the only kid they knew in Murray, Colorado, who had a tattoo at the age of 5. Naturally, the kids treated him like a rock star. Well, that was until Mr. Dreadful went crazy. It was a different story after that. He'd never forget Bobby Baker, the first-grade bully who liked to call him a whack job. Or Annie Hobart, who roasted him about not having real parents. He didn't know what happened to his mother or father, but he'd been told that his father was a banker. He wanted everyone to believe he had ordinary parents. But he didn't even have an ordinary grandfather. Anyone could see the old man demonstrate his magic on YouTube from a show called Top Magician, where a bunch of magicians came to perform their parlor tricks before an audience and a panel of judges. Which was fine for a time. But then the crazy thing. And as the saying goes, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. Of course, he much preferred what James G. Ballard had to say. In a totally sane society, madness is the only freedom.
Well,
Mr. Carbonaro started.
It's all right.
James suddenly said, cutting him off.
I know you've heard the rumors, sir.
His teacher sat back, arrogantly folding his arms.
Contrary to what you think, James, we hardly sit around the faculty lounge entertaining rumors.
And you said you didn't want to lie. Surely you've heard how weird my grandfather was. He was a magician. An old-fashioned magician. I mean, when I was 5, he took me to my first day of kindergarten in a chariot.
He noticed Mr. Carbonaro raise an eyebrow. Apparently, it did interest him to know if the rumor was true.
You probably also heard how I had to use a chamber pot because my grandfather believed toilets were some kind of demon. He had a rant on Good Morning America about toilets.
He could tell by his teacher's face that he'd probably seen the clip on YouTube, which, last he'd seen, had about 3 million views. Probably had a good laugh about it, too.
How he tried to skin my neighbor's Papillon because he thought her dog was a 3-headed mongrel from Hades. Then had his lawyer, which he liked to call his goblin, keep her quiet.
His teacher scratched his bald head, looking somewhat uncomfortable now. James continued.
I'm sure you also know the White House invited him to perform once, before all the craziness started. That was quite a buzz 10 years ago. Every news station covered that one. My crazy grandpa was expelled from the White House because he thought a cloud of fairies around the commander-in-chief's head had infected his brain. He offered to perform an old family remedy to get rid of them, which was a very outdated form of trepanation.
James could tell by the lack of surprise that Mr. Carbonaro had, in fact, not been living under a rock.
That's right, Mr. C. He wanted to cut open the President of the United States' head with a sacrificial knife.
Mr. Carbonaro regarded him with flinty eyes now.
And let us not forget how he burned his house down with me inside.
James could still feel the scar on his forearm where the burning board had clouded him as he ran out.
That was when the Child Protection Services took me from the house. My grandpa told the fire marshal he set the house on fire because... rats.
James, I don't see what this has to do with you
Fantastic
writing.
ideas on the essay? I thought you were smart, Mr. Carbonaro. My grandpa brainwashed me as far back as I can remember. Nobricoso, the land where fairy tales and myth were born.
James felt a chill dance down his spine when he said that. He hadn't uttered the name Nobricoso out loud in a long time. He was afraid that it would bring back the madness of his old days when he was still a wild child at 5, seeing all sorts of, well, stuff. It was a name that hung over his head for 9 long years. When he was 5, he stupidly said he was the boy from Nobricoso. So, naturally, the kids ganked him. He was the little fairy boy, or Mr. Unicorn. Of course, James made sure to put a stop to that. One thing he remembered his grandpa teaching him was to crush his enemies. And he did. He got suspended multiple times, kicked out of 3 private schools, even had the police called on him. In the end, no kid bullied or did so much as make fun of him, from East County to Rolling Ford. When Emma Green Wallace called him Fairy Boy, James said he'd pay her a visit when she was sleeping and cut off her ears and make a pretty little necklace out of them. That was just kindergarten. Emma would run screaming if she was in the same classroom with him after that. And when Bobby Baker called him a whack job, he said he'd slip him roofies in his lunch milk and then cut off his face, like Hannibal Lecter. Bobby thought it was funny, until one day he fell asleep, with his face in the urinal. That was first grade. A year later, he called Miss Stiller, the social studies teacher of a well-to-do private school, a harpy, and threatened to banish her to the confines of Tartarus. Which was a bit mild, he admitted. But when the principal, Mr. Hugo, had a special talk with him, James told him, very casually, that if he did not let him out of the office, he would crucify him and then have the superintendent drawn and quartered for running a mediocre education system.
But you seem to be doing well. You get good grades aside from my class.
I know.
So what's the problem? Why do you start again with this?
James rolled his eyes. He was sick of hearing people tell him how well he was doing, like he had some sort of mental problem. He got looks from Mrs. Mundwiller the other day like she was afraid he'd start climbing up the walls or eating erasers. But he hadn't threatened to eviscerate anyone in at least 5 years.
I don't know.
He said again, shifting his weight from one foot to the other while massaging the back of his neck, imagining he could feel the outline of the snakes there. He didn't know what made him write the stupid stuff on the essay. Ever since his grandfather had been admitted to St. Hildegard's Hospital for the mentally insane, and James had had to adopt the surname Brady from strangers, he'd had to see a shrink. She said exactly what you'd expect from a lady with a master's in psychology. There was no land of Narnia.
I think I do.
Mr. Carbonaro said at last, drumming his fingers on the desk.
Now that everything is settled and you're doing fine, you think it's time to stand out again. It's understandable. You miss all the attention you'd been getting all the years. The attention your notorious grandfather gave you.
So, let me get this straight, sir. You think I miss being the grandson of Mr. Meshuggah?
You're a bit of a renegade, James. You like attention. People listen to you because you were the boy of the mad magician who claimed he was from a magic world.
He made a triangle with his fingers before probing his chin with his indexes.
But it's old. It's time for you to grow up.
James stood up and hoisted his bag onto his shoulder.
You're right. You figured me out. I wrote that because I wanted attention.
He turned to leave, but then faced his teacher again.
But it's not what you think.
He gave a bit of a dramatic sigh, glanced down at his feet, and then met his teacher's eyes.
I just wanted to get your attention, sir, because, well, I've always dug your chili, sir.
Mr. Carbonaro's face slowly began to change color.
I've always found you irresistible. Really insightful of you to see that in my essay.
He could almost hear Mr. Carbonaro snarling in his throat like a Rottweiler.
Just please don't tell anyone about how crazy I am about you.
Get out of my classroom, you hooligan!
Mr. Carbonaro's
Gladly.
face had turned the shade of one of his bruised grapes. James walked out, suppressing the burst of laughter threatening to come out. But by the time he'd reached the schoolyard, he simply couldn't resist. Please like and subscribe so you can get the latest episodes of the Midjourney Storyteller.
Mr. Carbonaro?
Peekaboo!
Nut job.
Mr. Carbonaro?
James, why are you staring at me like that?
I never knew.
Mr. Carbonaro?
Okay.
Mr. Carbonaro?
Looks right.
Mr. Carbonaro?
Okay.
Mr. Carbonaro?
I'm okay with that.
Mr. Carbonaro?
I am the one who knocks.
Heisenberg!
Mr. Carbonaro, I love you. deserve that.